Okay, we've just tipped over 200 participants in the call, so let's get going. Um, Welcome to this webinar. We've got a few great speakers today. Thanks for joining in. Today we'll be digging in beyond the statistics into land clearing in New South Wales. My name's Dr. Brad Smith. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director at the Nature Conservation Council. For those of you who don't know NCC, we're the peak body for conservation groups in New South Wales, and I'm sure a lot of the people on the call are dialing in from one of the 200 member groups who we represent and who are fighting passionately across the state to protect nature and fighting for a safe climate. I'm guessing everyone here today is here because we all have a connection to New South Wales's unique and beautiful nature, whether that's the bushland, our marine life, the wildlife that we have that we enjoy living alongside here in New South Wales. And we've had over 500 RSVPs. We've just got 213 people on the call so far. So there is a lot of interest. You're not alone. There's a lot of us here who care about our nature and want to make sure that we're doing our best to protect it and respond to the big threats to our bushland and wildlife. And that's why we're putting this session on today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the country that we live and that we work on. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present. I'm on Gundagara and Darug country, and I'd encourage you to put in the chat which country you're dialing in from and which organisation you're from as well, if that's relevant to you. So today we're looking at land clearing in New South Wales because habitat destruction is one of the big drivers of biodiversity decline in New South Wales. It's also a huge issue for NCC supporters when we're sending out emails and communicating with people. Land clearing always comes up as a really hot topic. And the New South Wales government has made a commitment to rein in excessive land clearing. Unfortunately, since making that commitment, land clearing has continued unabated. There's even been a slight increase. So there's a lot of work to do. And that's why this is such a topical discussion today. I'd also like to acknowledge that this webinar is a joint piece of work. It's jointly organised by WIRES, by the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators, and the Biodiversity Council. It's so great to be working together with so many strong organisations to protect nature. And we also have some wonderful experts speaking today from the Wentworth group of concerned scientists, from Griffith University, UNSW, and the Biodiversity Council. So a huge thank you to those speakers for joining and presenting today. So we'll get into it. We'll unpack some of New South Wales's land clearing data. First, we'll hear from four speakers, and they'll go through some of the data, a lot of the background, what damage is being done, what wildlife's out there. And then we'll have 20 minutes for questions at the end. We'll have two other panelists join as well. So a really strong group of experts. So if you think of a question as we go along, you can note it down in the Q&A section. You should be able to find a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Put it there, and you can also thumbs up other people's questions if that's one that you'd like to see answered, and we'll get to as many as we can in that last 20 minutes. This is an issue that does bring out a lot of passion. So please stay polite in the chat and in the Q&A. We're here to have a robust debate, but always a civil one. And we will wrap up by 2 p.m. So I'll be making sure we keep our speakers on time. With that in mind, I'd like to go straight to our first speaker, who is Dr. Michelle Ward from Griffith University. Michelle's a researcher in conservation and policy, focusing on developing practical evidence-based solutions for biodiversity conservation and environmental sustainability. Most recently and relevantly, Michelle's a leading researcher on New South Wales land clearing rates, including the drivers and impacts on biodiversity. Welcome, Michelle, over to you.
Thanks very much for that, Brad. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Ward, and I am a research scientist at Griffith University. I'm also a lead scientist for the Griffith Institute for Human and Environmental Resilience. And so today I'm going to be talking about a new paper called Vegetation Clearing Continues to Erode Biodiversity Values Across New South Wales. So this is a statewide land clearing analysis, which looks at clearing over a 13-year period, so from 2010 to 2023, and looks at the impacts on threatened species, threatened ecological communities, and our river systems. So I probably am preaching to the choir here, but Australia is a mega biodiverse country. Because we've been an isolated continent for such a long time, we have this extraordinary ancient endemism. So 87 to 93% of Australia's mammals and flowering plants are found nowhere else on Earth. But coupled with that, we also are one of the worst nations for biodiversity decline. So, in fact, Australia holds the record for the most number of mammal extinctions compared to any other country across the world. And the number one driver that's pushing species towards extinction is habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. So we did an analysis in 2021, which we've just repeated to 2026, and we're seeing the same story. So habitat loss is driving the extinction for most species, including plants, inverts, fish, our reptiles, and is a close second behind invasive species and disease for frogs, birds, and mammals. So the aim of this study was to really dig into how much woody and non-woody vegetation was cleared from 2010 to 2023 and by what industry. Did the clearing rate change after the 2016 reforms? How much clearing was within threatened species habitats, threatened ecological communities, and riparian areas, so that vegetation next to rivers, and which legislation is authorising this clearing to occur. So a few of the speakers later on will really dig into the reforms and the legislation, but just for the knowledge for this project, there were major native vegetation reforms in 2016, which repealed the Native Vegetation Act and replaced it with the Biodiversity Conservation Act. So you'll see that I'll talk about the pre-reform period, which is this 2010 to 2014, the reform period from 2015 to 2017, and then the post-reform period, which is 2018 to 2023. So what we found was that from 2010 to 2023, almost 700,000 hectares of woody and non-woody vegetation was cleared. So this is an area larger than Sri Lanka. And it's important to note that this excluded vegetation lost due to natural events, such as, the 2019-2020 mega fires. We also excluded any clearing within plantation and forestry. And you can see in the map here, a very clear agricultural clearing going on in the brown, infrastructure in the grey, and then native forest logging in the green. We also broke down this analysis to annual vegetation clearing per hectare per year, and found that but in the pre-reform period, woody vegetation clearing was hovering around the 20,000 hectare mark, with a 161% increase during the reform period. That slowly tapered off in the post-reforms, but was still consistently around the 135% greater than in the pre-reforms. You can also see the different colours there. So consistently within, Queensland and globally, really, in the orange is agriculture, which is driving most of the vegetation clearing across New South Wales. This is then followed by infrastructure, and then followed again by native forest logging. We also intersected where the native vegetation, where the vegetation clearing was occurring, and found that more than 80% of the clearing was occurring on land used for native vegetation grazing. And interestingly, 40% of all clearing was within one ecological community, and that was the dry sclerophyll woodlands. So that's an example in the Cumberland dry sclerophyll forest at Bass Hill near Sydney. We then looked at what different biodiversity values were being impacted by this clearing, and found that 15,000 hectares was cleared within the biodiversity values map. So this is a map developed by the New South Wales government, and it identifies land with high biodiversity value that is particularly sensitive to impacts from development and clearing. So you wouldn't expect much clearing to be going on in these really critical places, but we found 15,000 hectares has been lost. We also found that 80% of New South Wales threatened species had been impacted by the clearing or had clearing within their mapped ranges. So that resulted in about 693 different species being potentially impacted, including the critically endangered grassland earless dragon and the vulnerable red lord whistler. 51 of New South Wales' 53 threatened ecological communities also experienced clearing within their ranges, and some experienced more than 14%. So this Warkworth Sands woodland lost 14%, and this is a threatened ecological community that only occurs in New South Wales, meaning that that's 14% of its global range. Oh, I've got one too many. Rivers are also not protected, so we found almost 34,000 hectares of riparian vegetation had been cleared between 2010 and 2023. Most, again, was for agriculture, so about 72%. And that's really concerning because rivers are so important for people, for our economy, for our biodiversity. The riparian zones offer bank stabilizations and buffer water temperature. They also filter runoff, so any sort of clearing can be really damaging to any sort of species downstream. And lastly, we also looked at what legislations are allowing land clearing. And so what we found was that the Native Vegetation Act had about 13% allocated to it. Same with the Local Land Services Act, about 13% or 54,000 hectares. About 5% was presumed allowable. So that category is defined as clearing for routine agricultural and land management activities that don't require any sort of Local Land Services Act approval. So things like clearing for fences or dams. One of the most interesting results that we found was that 66% of all clearing from 2018 to 2023 was unallocated. So unallocated clearing is defined by the New South Wales government as unable to identify a formal authorisation or was unable to presume clearing was authorised or allowable through some sort of visual interpretation of the imagery. So that's looking at using high resolution satellite imagery, for example. And so while this can be lawful, low level, or unreported clearing, it could also be potentially unlawful or non-compliant within regulations. And so finally, we've identified in the paper four key reforms. So one, we obviously need to curb broad scale clearing by strengthening regulation and incentives, especially within those high priority biodiversity areas. Expand biodiversity mapping to cover places that are irreplaceable or cannot be offset. These are features that are currently missing from the biodiversity values map and will really need to align to the EPBC Act reforms. Assess cumulative impacts. So a lot of the time this clearing is assessed in isolated cases, but you really need to look at landscape scale cumulative risk assessments to be able to make good decisions and improve transparency. So we need to be able to close that reporting gap on clearing approvals, exemptions and outcomes. So that's all from me. And if you want to read that paper, please do take a picture of that barcode and it should take you to the paper. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Michelle. What a wonderful and quick tour of land clearing in New South Wales, and some really shocking statistics in there. 693, sorry, species affected by land clearing. What amazing biodiversity we have. Okay, there's a few people asking in the chat if they're able to access the slides. I'm sure people are really keen to dig into some of those statistics and also be able to share them with their friends and families and hopefully with others as well, like their MPs. And we should be able to share that. We do plan to send out a post-webinar email, so we should be able to share most of those slides and statistics after the webinar. All right, keeping to time, let's move right along to our second great speaker, who is Professor David Eldridge, who's a professor at UNSW, and he'll be unpacking the myths surrounding the INS code, which is responsible for a really large proportion of land clearing in New South Wales. David is no stranger to New South Wales's arid and semi-arid environments. In fact, he's spent over 30 years working in New South Wales's inland ecosystems. His research is focused on understanding how human-induced land use impacts the ecology and vegetation in these arid and semi-arid environments. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Brad. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm coming from Gadigal and Bidjigal country at the moment, and I'd like to tell you about, there we go, uh, invasive native scrub, more properly known as encroachment or thickening. The term invasive native scrub is interesting because the word invasive conjures up warlike, aggressive, threatening plants, and scrub to me conjures up brambles and wasteland. So it's no accident that the architects of the INS code wanted us to think that this community that you can see here is nothing more than nasty, threatening wasteland. On the contrary, and we'll be looking at some of the advantages and the positive things about this community. But there's no doubt that the phenomenon that underpins this INS legislation is that woody plants are increasing. They're increasing globally, and there are many reasons for that. But the main reason is that they're either recovering from a history of substantial degradation, generally caused by European livestock, and they're increasing due to greater amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. More CO2 in the atmosphere gives these plants a competitive advantage physiologically over grasses and herbaceous material. So if we look at the top left-hand corner, woody plant encroachment in the southwestern US in a anti-clockwise direction, Spain, um, woody plant communities in central west New South Wales dominated by calitris pine, and of course those two beautiful camels that are grazing some lovely woodland species in Africa. So this encroachment phenomenon happens very quickly. And so this is some photographs from one of the old Soil Conservation Service monitoring sites in Western New South Wales. And we can see that in 1990, this particular property, this paddock, was essentially a grassland with a few shrubs. Within 12 years, it's a shrubland with no grasses. And this is a major issue for pastoralists. It's a major issue managing these systems when you are relying on herbaceous material for pastoral production to feed your sheep and cattle. So let's have a look at some of the myths. And there are a lot of myths associated with woody plant encroachment or INS. And one of the myths that these are biological deserts. These plants are critically important habitat for a whole range of shrub-dependent birds, such as that beautiful painted honeyeater with the yellow wing in the top center, and on the right-hand side, a honeyeater, the spiny-cheeked honeyeater, that rely on shrublands and woodlands. But these systems also support a whole raft of arthropods, small invertebrates that are important for pollinating plants, including crop plants, but also as prey items for other birds and reptiles. But there'll always be winners and losers. And as shrublands increase, grasslands decline, and birds such as the brown songlark, and tell me in the chat if I've got that name wrong, that brown bird in the top center, it relies on grasslands and open areas, and so will be disadvantaged by shrublands. The second myth is that encroachment reduces plant diversity, and this is completely untrue. We've done lots of work showing that there are a whole raft of plant species that are only found exclusively under shrubs, or some of them have greater abundance under shrubs. And you can see that photo of a shrub there with a beautiful collection of plants beneath it. Even species such as mosses, lichens, algae, cyanobacteria that are critically important in these systems for stabilizing the soil, they even have close links to shrubs. So there are a bunch of plants that rely on shrubs and do better in shrublands. Myth number 3, encroachment degrades soils. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We know that shrubs support high levels of carbon. Everyone's talking about carbon, high levels of nitrogen, and lots of other minerals and nutrients as well. And we know that shrublands also have quite stable soils, with some caveats, of course. So encroachment does not degrade soils. The fourth myth is that encroachment reduces water flow through the soil. Now, why would this be important? Well, it's important because in these dryland ecosystems, we need to get as much water into the soil as possible. Shrubs and other woody plants facilitate water movement through the soil. And it doesn't matter whether your system has low grazing, moderate grazing, or high grazing, there's always greater water flow through the soil beneath woody plants. So this brings me to this image here. Why is this system so degraded? Because when people talk about INS, they always bring up pictures like this that show an almost lunar landscape, unlike the one that I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. If I ask a group of pastoralists why this system is like it is, half of them will say, well, those shrubs, they're bad. They take up all the moisture. They're using up all the nutrients. They're creating wind erosion. We need to get rid of those shrubs. The other half of the pastoralists will say to me, this tells me a story that this system has been extensively overgrazed, usually by European livestock. I was interested in trying to unpack whether it's grazing or whether it's shrubs that's responsible for this typical INS scenario. And if we look at just three measures of function here on the left-hand side, nutrient cycling, the ability to cycle carbon and nitrogen and other nutrients, the ability to infiltrate water into the soil and to maintain its soil stability, then we can see that the general effects of shrubs is to increase functions. But the general effect of grazing is to reduce functions or to have no effect, a benign effect. So the message from this research is that grazing reduces or dampens the positive effect of shrubs on ecosystem functions. And we have a lot of work to show this. So finally, how do we move forward? These are my personal views, and many will agree and some will disagree. But in my view, clearing is incompatible with nature positive, and the INS legislation is included in this clearing. The invasiveness tests lack science and credibility. There is no rigorous science behind the notion that these plants are invasive. The second thing is that pastoralists, well, landholders, farmers are allowed to clear large areas of INS, up to 1,000 hectares, which in my view is excessive. We need to think about maximum areas of clearance that should be allowable. Absolutely no clearing in endangered EECs, and we heard Michelle say that despite the fact that that clearing is not supposed to happen in EECs, it still happens. I can accept that under some situations we need to manage these shrubs, no doubt about that. But we need more nuanced approaches. Instead of broad scale use of bulldozers, we need to think about more selective, kinder ways of managing these systems. And finally, we need more monitoring. We need more monitoring, the sort of stuff that Michelle's been talking about, clearing rates, but we also need more training, and not just for agency staff, but for the general public, so that we can understand the true value of these important communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. What an opening presentation. It's one of this invasive native species code is the code that's responsible for a huge amount of the land clearing in New South Wales. It allows a lot of bulldozing to go on, and so it's wonderful to hear a bit of science about why that code is a problem, and what a great way for the government to be able to fix some of the problems by reforming that invasive native species code. I can see lots of great questions coming along in the Q&A. Thanks so much to everybody who's posted one. Keep those questions coming, and if you like one of the questions that someone's already asked, please give it a thumbs up so we can come to that one earlier in the Q&A session. And thanks as well to the panelists who are trying to get through some of those questions and put in some quick responses as well. All right, our next speaker is Candice Bartlett from the Nature Conservation Council. Candice is a conservation officer here at NCC and is also the science communications officer at the Biodiversity Council, so working across two roles there. Candice is reporting back from some recent site visits, that she undertook across the Central West and Western New South Wales. And her background is in ecological science and also strategic advocacy campaigns. Candice has lived and worked across Northwest New South Wales for over a decade, and including doing some work with landholders on koala conservation. Great to have you here, Candice. Over to you.
Introduction. So, to start, I wanted to quickly pick up on something that David touched on. So, the importance of language we use in our laws and how that shapes the way people think and behave. When we give native plants and natural processes the wrong name, so calling them invasive, that really creates the social license to destroy them and can result in the loss of critical habitat. And a case study that I think really highlights that is a major prosecuted case of land clearing that occurred earlier this year, where landowners had illegally cleared more than 119,000 hollow-bearing trees. So, and we know that these take hundreds of years to form an important breeding and nesting habitat for wildlife. So during the court processes, it was revealed that the landowner was trying to justify saying that they had a permit to clear invasive native species. And it's true, all the trees they cleared on that list are occurring on that New South Wales government's hit list, but the laws definitely don't allow the clearing of that scale of mature trees. And I think this case really highlights the huge risks of INS label that can be misused or misunderstood and lead to the loss of critical habitat. And so if you've been wondering what species do occur on the government's native species hit list, it's these 45 species here. Some names you might be familiar with are river red gums, coolabah trees, lots of acacias and wattles as well. Next slide. So I want to hone in on what land clearing actually looks like on the ground. So for me, land clearing has been this huge policy, sort of abstract discussion for so long. You know, this many thousands of hectares is cleared and these are the policies that are enabling it. But at NCC, we really want to ask that question, what does land clearing actually look like in some of these clearing hotspots under a legislation enabling it, just to inform our advocacy around the on-ground reality. So we turn to the stats. 1, most tree clearing occurs for agriculture. 2, most clearing occurs in the western part of the state, as you can see on that map on the left there. And 3, most clearing is occurring under this mysterious code called INS. So we've been out in the field visiting sites that are marked on that map on the right there. In my work, there are 3 types of clearing that I've generally come across. One is this boundary clearing on the left. We had some really loose codes introduced after the bushfires, allowing for clearing for fire breaks on private property. But as you can see, again, there's too many loopholes, and it's allowing remnant vegetation corridors across a denuded landscape to be cleared. The other type of clearing that I come across is paddock tree clearing. So again, clearing those last trees in a largely denuded landscape, and the laws do permit that. And then general clearing, where you've got large patches of land being cleared. And it's that last type of clearing that I'd like to talk about now. And I want to share with you 4 different sites we've visited that have all been cleared under those INS permissions, but I think will illustrate something quite different at each site. So this is site 1. That yellow boundary up there, that's 50 hectares cleared. It looks like it's adjacent to lots of trees, and that's because the landowner has cleared right up to a protected state conservation area. And as you can see from that broader satellite image, it's actually in a broader cropping landscape, and that property is a registered cropping corporation. So they remove large swathes of vegetation as much as they can up into that boundary. These are some pictures of the adjacent woodland. So presumably lots of those shared habitat values are there with what's been cleared. It is koala habitat, as well as lots of habitat for other threatened species like the grey-crowned warbler there. And the species that are being cleared are like eucalyptus populnea and our native cypress pines. And this is what that clearing looks like on the ground. So this is what we call stick raking. So if you can see that attachment on the front of that dozer, and as you can see, yep, so ground's been raked back and forth, and you've destroyed the ground cover, any understory, and the top layers. So it's not a really gentle approach on the landscape, and that landscape's been reduced to 20 trees per hectare, so quite low density. This is the second site I wanted to share, and it's definitely one of the most extensive sites we have observed. So that property is 7,000 hectares and 90% of it was mapped as INS. But when you look at the satellite imagery, you can see as you progress from west to east, it's actually more of an open woodland to dense woodland, like that sort of natural makeup you'd see across the landscape. And over time, so the oldest landscape imagery we can access is back in 1985, so 40 years ago. And you can see that over time, those areas marked are around 5,000 hectares have cleared, and they've been maintained as open and cultivated country for farming use, resulting in that permanent change in land use. And the habitat type cleared there again is our native eucalypt woodlands, and again mapped as INS. And if you wonder what that one looks like on the ground, so again, this was just one of the most staggering and perhaps a more rarer case where they have cleared everything across the centre of that property. You've got this vegetation boundary, but thousands of hectares cleared and nothing left. This is the third site I wanted to share. Oops, sorry, just go back. The third site, this is the beautiful mulga woodlands are typical of our red dirt country in Western New South Wales. I think this photo on the right's really stark contrast because it shows you that the landscape was cleared, did have that diversity across it of the smaller shrubs and larger trees, and it's been cleared. It was part of 2,000 hectares that was cleared on that property. And when you look at species records, it was home to species like the major Mitchell cockatoo, which is a threatened species, and lots of our other animals that you'd find in inland ecosystems. And this is the last site I want to share. So I find this site also quite interesting and demonstrates something different. So this site was first cleared in 2017. Over 1,000 hectares was cleared. But if you look long enough at that vegetation and the photo, you can sort of see, oh, well, maybe that vegetation on the edges looks a bit younger, and your interpretations would be correct. So the site was first cleared in 2017, as mentioned. And at that stage, the veg was at least 40 years old, so as far back as we can go in the satellite images. And then they've started to re-clear that more recently, and that's what we've visited. And that landscape was a mallee shrubby woodland with eucalypts like our coolabah trees and populnea trees. And I think this case study, again, is very interesting because when you map it from above, it's less than 1 tree per hectare. So again, that's very significant removal of older growth trees, and it is part of a broader cultivated property if we're sort of speculating what that land might be permanently converted to in the future.
Just one more minute. Thanks, Candice.
Thanks. The last thing I wanted to share is why we're so concerned about this so-called INS clearing. So not only does it make up the largest proportion of clearing currently, but more than 3.2 million hectares have been approved for clearing that are yet to be cleared, and they are still under active clearing approvals, not only under the old property vegetation plans, so legacy approvals that are still valid, and also the current local land services codes. So we're really concerned that this remains a huge risk to biodiversity if those approvals were to be activated across the landscape.
Thanks, Candice. Thanks for your wonderful investigation there into some of the clearing that's happening across New South Wales. There's still lots of questions coming in. Thanks for that. Some of them are being answered in the Q&A. If people are posting questions in the chat, it's a little bit harder for us to keep track of. So I really recommend you look at the Q&A button and also just check if somebody else has already asked your question there. So moving right along to keep us on time, our next speaker is Michaelie from the Wentworth group of Concerned Scientists. Michaelie is the Healthy Landscapes Project Lead, and she'll be talking about the key priorities that the New South Wales Government needs to act on to meet its commitment to strengthen environmental protections and stop excessive land clearing. Michaelie works at the interface of environmental scientists and science and policy. She's an expert in New South Wales land sector policy and worked to develop the Wentworth Group's blueprint for healthy country and thriving regions. Thanks, Michaelie. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Brad, and hello, everyone. So I guess I just wanted to emphasize that the opportunity for reforms that we currently have in New South Wales, it only comes about once a decade. So yes, as Brad said, how can we make the most of this, and how can the government best fulfill their election commitment to end excess land clearing and strengthen environmental protections? We've been talking a lot about land clearing and INS here, and I want to talk about how tackling these issues will require a holistic approach. So the solution, my slide is just the one before this, I believe, that, the solution is multi-pronged, and it has to involve a long-term vision for change that bridges the common divide that we have between agricultural and environmental sectors. So we want to see reforms that are designed to endure beyond election cycles. The reforms need to protect our most precious biodiversity, restore degraded lands, and restore degraded landscapes. At the same time, we think that they can and should support agricultural outcomes and support regional communities. So yeah, as you can see on the screen here, you can read about the Wentworth Group vision for successful reform package, which is in this blueprint for a healthy country and thriving regions. And I would encourage anyone interested in the detail to read into it, but we've only got a short time, so I'll just highlight a few points pertinent to today's discussion. Next slide, please. So more than 70% of New South Wales is managed by private landholders, and so they have the central role in taking care of most of New South Wales land and nature that occurs there. And so it means that effective reforms are those that work directly with local land managers and regional communities and Aboriginal nations, understanding the regional specific issues affecting them, such as for pests and weeds, and provide the support that is asked for. By working alongside them, government can design effective reforms that encourage people to value, protect, and restore nature by choice. So there needs to be a combination of top-down state priorities as well as bottom-up design to ensure that these best outcomes for the landscape and that the central agents of change, the farmers, are not put offside in the process. Next slide, please. So from my fellow panelists' discussions, we can see that it's clear that high biodiversity value in New South Wales is not being sufficiently protected. So there still needs to be stronger protections for natural and cultural values that we decide as a state and as regions need to be better looked after and protected. So these need to be supported by properly resourced mapping so that we know where these values occur in their landscape. And the good news is that there are existing mechanisms in the Biodiversity Conservation Act that could be improved upon to provide this protection. Next slide, please. So in terms of land clearing codes, the system is intended for the clearing that occurs under these codes to be low risk clearing. And currently, that's not the case, as we've seen in David and Candice's presentations. Threatened ecological communities can be cleared, and these large areas have been cleared. So there's several changes that are needed to ensure the codes are genuinely only low-risk clearing. There's issues such as the quasi-offset set-asides and self-assessment, over-reliant on self-assessment that needs to be addressed. But removing the INS codes will reduce environmental risk, especially if it's done in conjunction with these other measures. And we're not talking about flat out banning any clearing that would have occurred under this authorization. As I said, it's about removing the higher risk types of clearing and ensuring that it's only low risk clearing. Lower risk clearing will be able to occur under other codes and other allowable activities, so other rules. Next slide, please. So there also needs to be a substantial investment in funding programs that support landholders in a variety of ways to undertake nature stewardship on their properties. So this can build upon existing programs that we have, but it needs to be expanded to include flexible options like short-term entry-level conservation agreements, training, and other options that farmers identify as useful. So it's as part of the regional design process, it can be designing this funding package of what will be useful for farmers. And the funding priorities should be aligned with the priorities for conservation and restoration so that where clearing risks impact on valuable biodiversity, useful stewardship options will be available for landholders as an alternative to choose. Next slide, please. So the local land service should have its remit and funding expanded to play an even stronger role in providing landholders with support to navigate land management options on their property and also the complex regulations. So they need to support landholders with ecological expertise and options to protect nature. Next slide. So just wanted to say the government has responded to reviews of the relevant acts with their plan for nature, which has committed to a series of actions to set nature on a path to recovery. So they've made a series of positive commitments, but very little has been set in stone at this stage. And time is running out. We've got the March 2027 election for New South Wales. So we really want to see this opportunity not being missed and making the most of it. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks so much, Michaelie, for that wonderful and concise summary of what needs to change in terms of regulations and incentives. So moving right along to our panel and answering some of these great questions people are putting in the Q&A. We've got two more panelists joining us, Cerin Loane from the Environmental Defenders Office and Michael Cornish from the Australian Land Conservation Alliance. I have a very quick... okay, so I think we've got, if all the panelists can turn their videos back on, it looks like we've got everyone there. So there's been some questions that have got a lot of thumbs up and a few people have asked, so I'll try to go to those ones first. And one of the first ones is around what's driving this clearing? Why do we still have land clearing? Is it cropping? Is it grazing? What's going on? And Michelle's posted a really helpful response already that on a paper that she did that showed that already half of New South Wales's bushland has been cleared since colonisation. And the remaining of the remaining 25 million hectares, 9 million hectares is also degraded. So given we've got so much cleared land already in New South Wales, what's driving this ongoing, stubborn, persistent increased land clearing that we've seen since the 2016 law changes? And if any of the panelists want to jump in and give their take on that. Sounds like we've got a tricky question. David, you've got a laugh there. Is this a complex one to answer?
Look, I guess it depends on context. I know I've been involved with illegal clearing around Moree and Walgett, and that's obviously for farming, for cultivation. Not only do you get a greater acreage of crop, but it also increases the value of your property, and the land depends on the land value. Western New South Wales, in some of the areas that Candice showed us, a lot of that is for cultivation as well. Given the price of diesel, I would imagine that clearing for grazing is probably not a profitable enterprise, so objective. So I'd imagine that most of it would be clearing for cropping.
Thanks, David. Any other quick thoughts on that one? Obviously, the state of our regulations are important there, and they've been weakened in the last few years. All right, well, I might move to the next hot question, which is around the EPBC Act. We've seen some significant momentum at a national level on nature law reform. There's been some big changes to the EPBC Act. Some are still being worked through. So, Michael, I might bring you in here. How does that change expectations for New South Wales laws? And with the EPBC Act changing is now an important moment for the state to strengthen laws here.
Yeah, so Sarah may have more to add, but I guess, firstly, I'd just make the quick point. I wouldn't describe the recent amendments to the federal environmental laws as reforms. It's certainly a mixture of steps forwards and steps backwards. But thankfully, the federal laws have tightened up their approach to nationally significant land clearance. There has been a clear step forwards in that regard. Those changes mean that the two hotspot jurisdictions in Australia that still allow large-scale land clearance to occur, which is only New South Wales and Queensland, now have every incentive to harmonise their laws with the more stringent federal laws. And if they don't, they're just going to make life harder for New South Wales landholders by requiring them to navigate the complexities of two different sets of environmental laws. I'm actually an interloper from South Australia. When I started to review how your land clearance laws operate in New South Wales, I was frankly just appalled. We just don't allow what's happening in New South Wales and Queensland to happen in the rest of the country. So, the New South Wales community really should feel comfortable expecting a better balance between nature and private operators. And to your point around, well, is this an opportunity for reform? Well, politically, the fact that the federal government has been the one to tighten up these land clearance exemptions means the New South Wales government has a clear opportunity to make much needed reforms whilst avoid taking as much political heat. So if not now, then when?
Thanks, Michael. That's a good call to arms that we need some action now. And maybe just on that prompt, Cerin, I might bring you in here. I know you've worked on New South Wales laws for a long time that Michael just described as completely inadequate. You were working on this when we used to have the old Native Vegetation Act. So I guess if there was one thing that you could change, or one big flaw that you would like to see fixed in our biodiversity conservation laws now to rein in land clearing, what would you have us focus on?
Thanks, Brad. For me, I think one of the biggest flaws with our current laws is its failure to actually protect habitat outright. So we've got certain safeguards in place, and we try to do things like have, sensitive land categorized and identify high values, but nothing actually in our laws says certain areas are just off limits to clearing. And to me, with the ability to still grant approval, we're going to keep seeing decisions being made where clearing occurs. If we really want to protect some of our high value areas, then we're going to have to make the hard decision and say, look, some of these areas are just off limits to clearing. We need to protect them. And I'm talking about things like, critical habitat, where we've got some of the last remnants of vegetation or populations of species. We identify critical habitat in our laws, but then we still allow decision makers to make decisions approving development that impact on those areas. So for me, I'm really looking at whether we can tighten up those areas for habitat protection in New South Wales to those areas where we really need the most protection.
Okay, thanks so much, Cerin. That's great. And maybe then just to round that out, the direct question we had here was, will these EPBC changes stop or slow down land clearing in New South Wales? And I guess if not, why not? Is that something that you could come back to, Michael, perhaps, or Cerin?
Look, I could, but Cerin's a better expert on this, I reckon.
Well, why don't I explain quickly what the changes were, because people might not actually understand what the changes were that we're talking about at the EPBC Act. So the thing I'd like to clarify is first that land clearing has always been regulated under the federal laws. It's not like all of a sudden it's now regulated for the first time. What's happened is that under our federal laws, if you're doing any action that has a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance, you need to get federal approval to do that action. In the case of land clearing, there was an exemption in the EPBC Act that said if you're doing a continuing use, then that approval requirement doesn't apply to you. And it's that continuing use exemption that's been relied on by landholders to continue to undertake clearing on agricultural land on the basis that it's something that they've been doing over many years. Now we've got to the point now where we've made a policy decision that actually, if we've got vegetation that's regrown and it's older than 15 years old, it actually has environmental value, and we want to protect that, and we don't want landholders, or we don't want people to continue to use that continuing use exemption. So the change that's happened is that if you've got regrowth vegetation that's now over 15 years old, you can't rely on that exemption, and you do need Commonwealth approval. And also, if you're clearing in a riparian area in the Great Barrier Reef, you cannot rely on that exemption, and you need approval. So that's the main change that's happened there. In New South Wales, our rules allow clearing of regrowth right back to 1990s, kind of where we've set the bar. And so if we want to align ourselves with where the Commonwealth has set the bar, we really need to think about, how we're going to be regulating regrowth clearing in the future, and perhaps aligning our laws here in New South Wales to say, well, look, we also agree that, if you've got habitat or vegetation that's 15 years old, that it probably has some environmental value, and we shouldn't just be allowing that to be cleared, and we need to tighten up the regulations around that. But back to your question, Brad, is at the end of the day, we haven't said you can't clear those areas. All we're saying is you need to put in an application for approval, and it's still open to a decision maker to approve clearing in those areas, which goes back to my original point that there are just some areas where we probably have to say, well, actually, no. If you're going to clear here, then you're going to have an impact that's not going to happen, which brings me to one of the other changes in the EPBC Act is we've now got provisions in there around unacceptable impacts. So if you're going to have an unacceptable impact on a matter of national environmental significance, then it must be refused. And so having a similar rule here in New South Wales, where we see unacceptable impacts as being impacts that just shouldn't go ahead and should trigger a refusal, is another area where we can align with those EPBC Act reforms.
Thanks, Cerin. Some really practical suggestions there for what needs to change. We've got a couple of questions around our MPs, our parliamentarians, and advocacy. So the first one was, is our environment minister on the call, or any MPs on the call? And there was one response in the Q&A, which was James Vernon, representing the member for Pittwater, Jackie Scrooby. So good to have James and Jackie represented on the call there. But I think broadly that also highlights that no, there's not too many MPs who are on this call. And so, to me, that's a call to action for the 260 participants on the call now to think about reaching out to your local MP and making sure that they're, fulfilling this commitment to rein in excessive land clearing in New South Wales, and being armed with some of the wonderful science that we've just heard today. Wendy also had a question about how do we resource the conservation sector to balance out those big vested interests like cotton, mining, large agribusinesses who are lobbying the government as well as doing a lot of this land clearing. How can we resource our conservation sector to get in there, brief MPs, and push the public debate forward? So that's a tricky one. It's a good curly question from Wendy. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I mean, I'm just heartened.
I have a very quick comment. Yeah,
Thanks, Michael.
my very quick comment would be, this is why we have to rely on community power, because we're not going to ever be able to outspend various vested interests. We have to rely on the community being aware of what's going on and understanding that once people are aware, most people will care, and being able to harness that energy in a political sense. That's really what it's about. Some really good science as well is always very useful, as you've seen.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Michael. We're relying on the many, not the money. And I think that's such an important point about awareness as well. And, survey after survey shows that people do want to see our nature protected. They expect our governments to be looking after it. So when they're aware that the damage is happening, that's, I think, when we can mobilize some public opinion. All right. Well, just looking through the Q&A, we've answered a few of them. Peter Wright has a really interesting one around reforms going way back to the late 90s and early 2000s, changes to land clearing laws that did significantly reduce land clearing rates. Peter's point is that at that time, there was some lobbying saying that would also destroy regional economies. Doesn't seem like those Native Vegetation Act rules did destroy regional economies, but is there any evidence about how farming and regional economies were resilient to tighter regulations on land clearing? Maybe any of the folks have been working out in Western New South Wales for a while. David, have you got thoughts on that one?
I don't really have any comments to make, except that there's often a lot of criticism about how conservation takes people out of the country and reduces regional communities. You only have to look at those new national parks in northwest New South Wales around Burke. There's been a lot of controversy lately. And in fact, what we find is that conservation agencies put probably as much or more money into the community than would be lost when pastoralists sell their property. So that's the only comment I've got to make.
Yeah. Thanks, David. And, looking at some of the images that Candice put up, I guess, it's soils blowing away. There's, a lot of loss of productivity, I think, from some of this land clearing as well. Did you want to weigh in on that one, Candice?
I want to segue that question into a point I'd like to make about INS is that while those reforms did occur in the early 2000s, our first Native Vegetation Act, it's actually also the first time that this code INS was introduced. So it's very much a political construct. And was a bit of a negotiation to allow broad scale clearing to continue. So those laws, while there were some good things, they weren't perfect. And we'll be releasing a report soon to unveil the risks of INS clearing. So keep an eye out for that one.
Thanks, Candice. Well, look, it's almost 2 o'clock. It's been a fascinating discussion, and so thanks everyone for contributing your questions. There were a few questions that we didn't get to, and so we'll be asking the panelists to try to answer those, and we can send around a little email after this session with some written answers. I'd like to thank the 250 people who joined the call, as well as our 6 panelists and speakers. Thanks so much for sharing so much insight and science. And I'd like to encourage everyone on the call to take a next step with this, armed with this information. Candice has put a link in the chat to a do-gooder that will link you up with your Member of Parliament, so you can send them a message asking them to close these awful exemptions that allow so much land clearing to go on. So please jump into the chat, find that link, and send a quick message off to your local Member of Parliament. We've been recording this session, so we can send that webinar recording around in the next few days, so look out for that email. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. I hope you've had a productive hour and you've enjoyed the discussion. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar or at the next event.